This is International Master Eric Kislik, and today we'll be looking at the game between Caruana and Aronian from round 13 in Berlin. This was an extremely crazy round. The final round tomorrow is going to be very, very wild. Wow, so many people were so worried that Karjakin was going to break through, and he's leading on tiebreak. So had the final games been drawn in rounds 13 and 14, he would make it through. So it's really amazing to see Caruana come back and get a big win, and beating Aronian is no easy task. So let's get to it. So this one went e4, e5. So Aronian is known for his Ruy Lopez. He normally plays the Marshall, rook e1, b5, bishop to b3 castle. So rather than playing c3, d5 and going into the Marshall, Caruana decided to go for d3 to avoid Aronian's preparation, and also to just get a long game, a long, slow game. And he presumably just wanted to test out this idea. He played bishop d2, which was a move a lot of people were wondering about, and basically he just stops knight a5. So for instance, the main line goes c3 and black goes knight a5, and then expands with c5, and then comes back with knight c6. And here black doesn't have any space problems. Black just has to solve a couple issues with a couple of remaining minor pieces. He has to solve the problem of what to do with the c8 bishop. He usually will try to improve the bishop on e7, oftentimes putting it on g7. And once black solves those problems, usually the position is equal within a few moves. So anyway, bishop d2 was played. And there were a lot of choices for Aronian here. He went for bishop g4, which is completely fine. And one other point about this is that because the bishop is on d2, there's no knight bd2, which is a natural counter to bishop g4. So white goes c3 to avoid knight to d4. Black goes d5. And white just goes h3. So white just tried to go for a solid position here. And black had a couple of pawn structure transformations he could have made here. He could have actually taken and then played d4. And this would have been interesting, mainly because of the fact that the knight on b1 has a hard time finding its way into the play. For instance, a4, queen d7, and black can just follow up with rook f d8, and the position is about equal. So taking on f3 was definitely fine, but he just went back with bishop h5. Bishop h5 was fine. The only thing he has to worry about is that maybe the bishop might be a little bit offsides on h5 and might have to go back to g6, which is normally a pretty unpleasant place for that bishop to stay in the Ruy Lopez because it just doesn't have much scope biting the e4 pawn. So white went queen to e2, and black simply played rook to b8. This is fine. I mean, it's a nice counter to white playing a4. So he's just preemptively supporting the b5 pawn. In some cases, he may want to go ahead with b4, but white decided to go for bishop g5. Again, a very interesting practical choice. Probably black's best would have just been to go back into that other line and just play it this way. And for instance, if knight d2 now, then to play h6, and this looks completely fine for black. So d takes e4 was played. D takes c4. So this is often an equalizing idea for black, just to simply take on e4, but you need to follow up well here or else you will not be able to succeed in fully equalizing. So part of the problem here is that black has slightly awkward pieces and white has the plan that was executed in the game. You'll see what white plays on the queen side in the game, which is quite powerful and typically slightly better for white. So what I would have tried with black is just knight to d7, trying to exchange off the bishop on g5, and after the bishop retreats to e3 to go bishop c5. And then after knight bd2 to go queen to f6, and if g4 to just simply take on e3 and go bishop g6. And white will go ahead with a4, and white is still slightly better here. So this is one way the play can develop. Arguably, h6 is just as good. And this had a very interesting idea. The idea is that after bishop to h4, there's knight d7, and here the bishop doesn't have a good retreat square. For instance, if bishop to g3, then black can go bishop g5 and put his bishop on a quite strong diagonal. So bishop c1 was played. This was a really nice move. This kind of retreat is exactly the kind of move that's usually skipped over, not really commented on, but a very, very strong move. He simply moves the bishop out of the way. If it's on e3, part of the problem is that the e4 pawn may be undefended. If it's on d2, then the knight can't develop. If it's on h4, we allow knight d7. So bishop c1 was an excellent retreating move. And if black goes for something like knight to a5, we can just retreat and go knight bd2 and play knight f1, knight g3, and knight h4. And this is definitely going to be at least slightly better for white. So bishop g6 was played. The problem is the bishop is just not very effective here. And what I would have played is probably just bishop c2 first, just supporting the e4 pawn, and then trying to play a4. For example, rook e8, a4, takes, knight a3 is one way to continue. So knight bd2 was played. And now after, if rook to e8, bishop c2, bishop f8, white can just go knight f1 and then play a4. So still, black is not equal. So I think almost throughout the rest of the game, black was simply struggling. And a lot of that was just simply based on the pawn structure and based on the g6 bishop being out of play. So black went for knight h5, which simply was not a very effective plan. So knight h5, and here white could have actually just played the simple g3. And if queen d7, just king g2, defending the h3 pawn. And if knight f6, I would just go bishop c2 and simply go knight h4 and knight f5. And white has a quite serious advantage. In any case, he went for knight f1, bishop c5, and here he went g3. He could also just go bishop c2, but g3 was good. And here king h7 really disturbed black's piece coordination. So knight h5 turned out to be quite ineffective, but the king on h7 isn't good for the g6 bishop. And you'll see why in a few moves. So I was thinking the knight should just come back, bishop c2, queen d7, attacking the h3 pawn. White goes g4 and then knight to g3. And this is a better plan because the fact that black has played a5 takes some of the sting out of a4 by white. So now if a4, black can always answer with b4. And here white doesn't really get that much on the queen side, so this would have been the best way to play. So white would have still been slightly better in this position, but it wouldn't have been nearly as bad as the game for black. So king h7 was played. White simply played king to g2. Solving all the problems with his king, keeping everything secure on the king side. And I still think knight f6 probably should have been played. Queen e7 was played, bishop to c2. Quite a good, useful move. And now there are ideas of going a4 or b4. So if, for instance, queen e6, we can just go a4. So rook f d8 was played, and now white played b4. Actually, a4 would have been a very nice idea to play here as well, because now we might just be able to play a4 and knight h4 and simply avoid playing b4 altogether. For instance, if queen to e6, we can take on b5 and then play rook to a6. And this looks like quite a nice way to play. For instance, if here, we can go g4 and knight to g3 and knight to f5. So this would probably just be winning for white. So a4 is probably a little bit stronger. You can just play the same idea as he played in the game, just one move earlier. But of course, b4 was a good move. There was nothing wrong with it. So now we went b4, a4. And if we look at this pawn structure, this is a typical kind of pawn structure for this opening. And it's also basically what black's trying to avoid in a lot of different variations. So if you just simply look at black's pieces, both of the knights are ineffective. They don't have squares to jump to. Both of the bishops are quite ineffective. So strategically, black is in a very bad position, mainly because of the minor pieces. And also, the rooks are not effective either. The rook on the b file can't do anything, and the rook on the d file, yes, it has the open file, but it's not really doing anything. So I would have simply tried to cover b5 and try to keep everything safe. For instance, knight e3, knight f6, knight g4. But here, white also has ideas like playing rook to h1 and going g5 to try to attack the king. h6 is a focal point here. So in any case, knight to f6 was played, and probably the best idea for white was just to take the pawn on b5 because the knight on c6 is attacked. So if bishop takes f2, we can just take here and play here. If bishop takes e1, we can just play knight takes e1, and black simply doesn't get enough. So the knight f6 kind of gambit, you could call it, was not correct. So knight h4, just a simple move, targeting the bishop on g6. Queen to e6 was played, and now white played bishop to d3. So I was thinking just knight takes g6, f takes g6, bishop d3, and then rook to d1. And this is quite unpleasant for black, just kind of dealing with the problems here on the queen side. For instance, if b takes a4, we can just go bishop c2, and then regain the pawn on a4, and the a6 pawn is quite weak after that. So this would be very good for white, probably objectively winning. So bishop d3 was played, still quite a good move, although black could have played queen to d7 and then knight to e7 and then knight takes g6, knight takes g6. This would have been black's best chance of trying to hold together the position. But of course, white is still better. White can just go a5 and bishop to e3 and, execute this exchange, and still definitely has a better position. Good squares for the white knight, whereas black's knights don't really have any useful squares here. All the squares are covered on the king side. So bishop h5 was played, which was a quite desperate move. White just went g4 here, basically said, okay, well, if you want to go for a sacrifice, let's see it, but I don't think it's correct. So Aronian just went for the sacrifice, but it was clearly dubious. Of course, he wasn't going to go queen takes g4 and go into this endgame, because, for instance, here takes, bishop takes g4, and this has to be winning for white. So he wasn't going to go for that. With the two bishops there, they're going to be far too powerful there. So knight takes g4 was played. All right, so white went knight f5, strong move. And now the bishop on f2 and the knight on g4 are working together, but the knight on g4 is undefended. So this has to be played. Knight takes f2, and now the d3 bishop is attacked. So white just simply moved it back with bishop to c2, and it's a very interesting position here with the knight on f2. So yes, black does have 3 pawns for the piece, but white does have the bishop pair. Black's king is potentially exposed, and the knight on f2 is in a pretty awkward spot. So g6 was played here. Here I have a much simpler plan than what was played, simply to go a5, and then to just simply drop back. Simply knight 5 to e3. And if knight h3, then simply knight to d5, and white's winning here. So this would have been much better than what was actually played, because what was actually played allowed an amazing rejoinder for black, which I didn't see mentioned in the commentary. I followed some of the GM commentary during the game. I did not see them mention it. So takes. So white sacrifices the piece here, queen to f6, but gets the knight on f2 back. And now black had a very serious chance. I think the idea was just simply missed, because what black needs to do here is black needs to find a way to get the rook active. And also, white's idea in general is to put the king on f1, and once it's on f1, it's just going to be very, very safe. And so that's why this idea of knight takes b4 is really a phenomenal sacrifice. It's just extremely brilliant. And the idea is, if takes, there's rook to d4. And I must admit, you would never find the idea unless you recognize that you had to put the rook on f4, and you also wanted to sort of prevent this idea of the king being able to escape. But that being said, this can be found through process of elimination, because really everything looks so bad here for black that he really should look for anything, even if it seems a bit desperate. So rook to g8 check, for instance, isn't going to do anything because the king just runs away to f1. So once you determine that the white king is safe on f1, you have to look for anything. So takes rook d4 is very, very interesting. And let's say king h3, trying to make the king safe. We can go queen g5 with black. So this just gets more and more interesting. So let's say check and then bishop to d1. Black can play rook g8, and suddenly there are some threats here for black. So after knight to g2, there's rook to f4, which is a very nice move, very kind of almost comical tactics here. And white can play rook takes e5, rook takes f2, bishop takes g5, bishop d4. Again, pretty funny tactics here with all the undefended pieces. But white will go bishop h4, which is a nice move, just hitting the rook. And after takes, this endgame is probably going to end in a draw, just simply due to the limited material and the fact that the minor pieces are going to coordinate pretty well. So this is an amazing star move. Knight takes b4 is just a fantastic chance that black simply missed in the game. And so he played the move e4. I understand why he tried to do it, but white's king was completely safe here. So there was really almost nothing to see. So now if you look at white's attack, the focal point h6 makes black's king very, very weak. So rook d6 was played, and simply bishop takes e4. And after rook g8 check, king f1. And now we see exactly what I was talking about. The white king is completely safe on f1. And we've been seeing this in some of the games in the tournament, that it looks like one side is being attacked, but then it just so happens that the king finds a safe square, and then there are no focal points, and there's no way to actually target the king after that anymore. So if rook g5, we can go, for instance here, Okay, because of the rook on a1, we'll just go queen to e2, but we can play knight to g4, and that works out very well for us as well. So anyway, after knight to e5, queen f4 was a very strong move. And black played c6, and white just went a takes b5. And there wasn't a whole lot to see here because, for instance, if a takes b5, we can play take, f6 check. If rook g6, takes, and then knight c4 check. And then, it's almost comical that everything is hanging here. So after a takes b5, rook g5 was played. Again, pretty desperate. B takes a6. The a pawn is very strong. If black plays bishop a7, I might just go rook a5 with white, and this has to be winning here. So queen to d8 was played, and white just went f6 check, and rook takes h6 is a very serious problem. So after knight to g6, white just went rook takes h6 check, and there wasn't a whole lot to see here. Part of the problem is, let's say the king takes, we can just play knight to g4 check and just take on g5. The king can't come to h5 because of simply mate. The queen is supported by the bishop on c1. So after rook takes h6 check, Aronian resigned. Really amazing position that they had after move 30, specifically on move 31 after queen takes f2. Black had a chance there, but I admit, a very, very difficult move, so it's hard to fault Caruana. He played a nice opening idea. He put some pressure on black, made him try to come up with a unique plan, and just played very slowly and confidently. The move bishop c1 was a very nice retreating move, and he just slowly prevented black's counterplay, played against his minor pieces. All of black's minor pieces just were simply quite passive. Black decided to go for a sacrifice. It wasn't really correct, but it did have to be refuted accurately. Unfortunately, both players missed a couple of key ideas here, but I still think Caruana's play was very convincing, and this was a much-needed victory for Caruana. It's going to be an amazing round tomorrow. Hope you enjoyed the video.